Okay, so I'm seeing a nice, some people saying hello in the chat, Rita and Muhammad. Nice to meet you both. Thank you so much for joining us. I'll get us, there'll be people trickling in, but my part of this webinar is the least interesting. So I think people won't be missing too much by missing my introduction. But just to start us off, I'm Lama Murad. I'm an assistant professor at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University in Canada, and an executive member of the Arab Political Science Network. The Arab Political Science Network, for those of you who are, who are joining us for the first time, we're a nonprofit scholarly initiative, and our main mission is really to connect Arab political scientists in and outside the MENA region, and to enhance and increase their research initiatives and the work of teaching political science and related fields in and outside of the MENA region. So today, I'm really excited for our webinar. It's really a fantastic opportunity to hear from two wonderful scholars who have done extensive amounts of research on the question of how we both kind of empirically how we study Arab Americans, but also thinking deeply about sort of the challenges methodologically and conceptually in this field. Sort of there's a big kind of asterisk around the term Arab Americans, which I think we're going to delve into quite extensively in both the presentations. And I'm very, very happy to have you all join us today. So I'll just quickly present both of our speakers, and they'll forgive me, I'll be giving kind of an abbreviated biography of each of them, and then we'll move to short presentations, about 10 to 12 minutes from each speaker, and then open it up to general discussion and Q&A. So Dr. Yusuf Shoud is a political scientist and an assistant professor at Christopher Newport University, where he directs the minor in human rights and conflict resolution. His research has focused primarily on the questions of the determinants of support for core democratic norms in different understudied groups. So Arab Americans and Muslim Americans being some of those groups. And he's published in the Journal of Politics and Religion. He's had some work actually working with Dr. Joachim on a collected volume. And he's recently worked on the Oxford Handbook of Polling and Survey Methods and the Understanding Muslim Political Life in America, Contested Citizenship in the 21st Century. Dr. Joachim is a sociologist, and unfortunately, I feel like we dropped maybe Dr. Joachim, but hopefully she'll be able to join us. I don't know if her internet just cut off, but while I'm introducing her, unfortunately, we've lost her briefly. But Dr. Joachim is actually a sociologist, and so when we think about political science at APSN, we have a relatively inclusive definition to think about the sort of broader social science community. And so Dr. Joachim is a sociologist who focuses on race and ethnic relations. She earned her doctorate from the University of Florida, and her dissertation examined the lives of millennial children of Arab immigrants who grew up in the United States. And her work really focuses on questions of identity construction and the development of children of Arab immigrants. Currently, Dr. Joachim co-directs two research projects at the Center for Business Leadership for Women in the Olayan School of Business at the American University of Beirut. So Dr. Joachim is also, has the privilege of both having studied and conducted research in the United States and now working with an institution in the region itself, obviously a very esteemed institution, the American University of Beirut. So I'm hesitant to start without Dr. Joachim back on the webinar, but Dr. Shoud was going to be the first presenter in any case, so maybe we'll get started, and then hopefully we can get Dr. Joachim back online. So I'll pass it over to you, Yusuf, and hopefully we can get Claudia back.
Okay, thank you very much, Lema. Good morning for those of you in the US, good afternoon, perhaps even good evening for those of you around the world. I'm really happy and privileged to be joining you today. And I just want to give a sincere shout out and convey my gratitude to the Arab Political Science Network, such an important and hopefully still burgeoning and will continue to grow initiative that so many folks have come together to put forward into the world. So let me share a little bit of what I got here this morning, and really I'm looking forward more so to your questions, but hopefully I can give a bit of a sense, a bit of a start to kind of get us off here. So I'm going to be talking about some insights, some challenges when it comes to Arab American public opinion. So I work primarily with quantitative data. I'm not here to start any methodological wars. It's just, my, idiosyncrasy. Certainly, I very much value and very much look forward to Claudia discussing her work as well. I'm just going to give you kind of from my perspective some of the things that have kind of come to the fore as I studied this community in the United States. So to get us started, just some kind of basic descriptives here. So when it comes to the population of Arab Americans, right off the bat, I mean, we see that there is this discrepancy. According to the census, they estimate the Arab American population at a little over 2 million, but according to the Arab American Institute, which some of you may know, and it's run by James Dogby and very well regarded surveyor of public opinion here in the United States, not just with regards to Arab and MENA issues, but more broadly as well. So the Arab American Institute estimates, there's well over 50% more Arab Americans than the census, somewhere in the vicinity of about 3.6 million. So that's just to kind of get started. When it comes to kind of socioeconomic data, just looking at the census data, you see that Arab Americans tend to be a bit more educated than the general public, more or less on the same on parallel ground with the general public when it comes to kind of median household income. But something that I'm sure is, kind of top of mind, just because it always is when we're talking about Arabs and Middle Easterners more generally, is this notion of religion. Who makes up Arab Americans? And I have question marks there because we're not really very sure. I think conservatively, what we can say is that contra to the Middle East more generally, the majority of Arab Americans are likely Christian. How much of a majority? That is a little hard to nail down. So why is the data on Arab Americans, so sparse or otherwise questionable? Well, it goes back to the unending fascination with race that we have here in the United States and tying societal standing to one's racial designation. As you can see, the menu of which has kind of changed, has ebbed and flowed based on, the political winds. So, in the beginning, the Naturalization Act said that anyone who is a free white person could be a citizen. And it wasn't until, right around this time in the 1950s, when finally the Nationality Act of 1952 abolished any racial restriction on citizenship altogether. But in the intervening time, you had to be a white person in order to be naturalized as somebody immigrating to the United States, and this led to this strange phenomenon here in the U.S. where Arabs actually petitioned for whiteness. And the first case where there was actually a successful petition wasn't until 1909, where a Syrian Christian went up to a judge and said, listen, if you think I'm Mongolian, well, then you think Jesus was Mongolian too, because him and I, we're neighbors, right? And the judge bought that. And so he became the first Arab naturalized as an American, the first Arab to kind of gain so-called white status. But this leveraging of a shared religious background as something of a passage into whiteness as conceived of here in America allowed judges to really consider Syrian Christians racially different than Arabs more generally, whom they still conflated with being Muslim. And so it was many decades later until the first Arab Muslim became naturalized as a US citizen. And finally, in 1977, the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget here in the US, the Census Office, categorized white persons as those from Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. And of course, the Middle Eastern and North African community has been enjoying the privileges of being white in the United States for decades since. Not quite, right? Indeed, obviously, especially in a post 9/11 context, there has been rampant discrimination targeting Arab Americans, regardless of religious background. And even those, thought to be Arab or thought to be Muslim that weren't either. And so there has been a more recent push, and I'm sorry for the low quality of this picture. Unfortunately, it was the only one I could find. A more recent push to change the census categories to include a potential Middle Eastern and North African category. And this was, really looking like it had some steam, that it was going to be in the most recent decennial census that took place just last year. But towards the end, when it was actually going to be fielded, unfortunately, it kind of fell through. The rationale was a little hard to understand why. But this shows you, right? This is the reason why it's so hard to really study Arab Americans. This means that Arab Americans effectively get subsumed within the ocean of white Americans more generally, which, as you can imagine, poses numerous methodological challenges. The first of which being that there's really no valid sampling frame, to put it in less, jargony language. There's no kind of standard reference that we can turn to say, okay, these are, this is what this population looks like, so that you can compare and see, how your sample kind of measures up to that. And so that poses a lot of, challenges when you're trying to talk about and generalize what you find on Arab Americans. And this isn't just for, the kind of the highest quality data, even, the less than ideal methodological choices that you can make, where you're just simply going to one of these survey companies like Qualtrics or SSI here in the United States and saying, if you want to have a sample of American Jews or even Mormons, right, these minority communities, it's much easier to get because religion often gets asked on these surveys that kind of populate their samples, even if it's not asked on the census. But on these surveys that populate these samples, rarely is there an option, is there a menu option to say that you're Middle Eastern or Arab. And so there isn't even a pool of Arabs in this less than ideal source that we can kind of draw on. And so this leads to kind of geographic limitations in our knowledge. What we end up doing is kind of going to these so-called Arab enclaves, right? So Arabs tend to cluster in, high urban areas. So New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Detroit. And so that's where much of this research is drawn from, for the simple fact that it would just simply be resource intensive, far too resource intensive, to kind of go outside of these concentrated areas. And then there are also temporal constraints. So the Detroit Arab American study, and as you can tell, even with the temporal constraint, there's still a geographic constraint as well. The Detroit Arab American study, which, as far as I can find, is the only publicly available data set on Arab Americans. It's coming out of the year 2003, really high quality data, right? But obviously a lot has changed since 2003. But much of what we know about Arab Americans inferentially really does come out of that, again, very high quality survey. And then naturally enough, we find these population blind spots, perhaps a little counterintuitively, even though the majority of Arabs are Christians, we actually have far more data on Arab Muslims. And that's because there have been a lot more data collected on Muslims in America more generally, from which we can pull out the Arabs in those surveys and gain a bit more knowledge about them. To that end, I figured, let me try and do that. And so in my forthcoming piece in that edited volume that Lemma mentioned, that Dr. Uwarkin is a co-editor on, I draw on these sources from the Pew Research Center, as well as from the Institute of Social Policy and Understanding, these multiple waves of surveys that they've done and pulled out all of the Arab Americans that are in those polls. And my objective was basically to discern the attitudinal and behavioral differences between recent immigrants and the next generation, the generation that was born here in the United States. Why? Because, well, it touches on a number of different domains that we might be interested in. Notions of democratic learning, notions of integration, assimilation, acculturation, whichever word, you want to use, whichever definition for whichever word you want to use, but all that is kind of invoked through this kind of survey. This is kind of a first step to kind of get us some empirical grounding for some of these issues that we might want to examine. So what did I find? So just to give, like real quick, so if something is significant on the right side of the table, that means on that metric, you are more likely to be US born. And if it's significant on the left side of the table, then on that metric, that you are more likely to be foreign born. So I looked at religiosity, right? So this is a very common measure of assimilation, integration, and on all the measures of religiosity, there's complete parity between immigrants and those born in the U.S. So that really has some clear implications for what we think the future might look like for Arab American Muslims in the United States. Where there is some discrepancy, though, is in experiencing and processing discrimination. So overt discrimination seems unfortunately pretty equally distributed between immigrants and native-born Arab American Muslims. However, the frequency of discrimination seems to tend towards more those who are born in the US. And this could be for a number of possible reasons, right? Perhaps they are putting themselves in situations where they are more liable to get discriminated, right? When they don't fear that discrimination, but they recognize that discrimination, or more so to that recognition point, perhaps they code different actions as discriminatory that those who are immigrants might not be able to kind of read as such. And then this final metric here, it's associated with levels of kind of internalized Islamophobia. Immigrants are far more likely to have at least some buy-in to this anti-Muslim rhetoric that unfortunately has populated the U.S. in recent years, whereas native-born Arab American Muslims really are kind of pushed back against that. One last thing that I just kind of want to hit on is as I'm sure with the election having recently passed, a lot of folks have probably been wondering how did Arab Americans vote. I just want to kind of quickly show this. So you see that there's some discrepancy on the basis of religious affiliation, probably a clearer discrepancy in terms of generation, so age cohort. What are the explanations for this? Well, one kind of basic explanation may just be that it's simply a regression back to the mean, right? So you're just going back to that pre-Obama era of party affiliation. I'd be more than happy to kind of talk a bit more about this, but what I want to end on here is kind of a broader question. Who counts as an Arab? So AAI, the Arab American Institute, they include Somalis and Sudanese. Maybe some Somalis and Sudanese think of themselves as Arab. I imagine there's a good chunk of them that don't. So what do we kind of make of that? How do we code that? Are we trying to just simply force a label on individuals, or are we more concerned about self-identification? Same thing with religious and ethnic minorities, right? Are Chaldeans Arabs, right? Are Maronite Christians Arabs? You ask certain scholars, they'll say yes. You ask certain Chaldeans and Maronite Christians, they'll say no. Again, what are we trying to capture when we talk about Arab Americans? And so this is where I think we really can learn from the wealth of literature that has been devoted to studying minority groups here in the US over the years, particularly Asian Americans, many of whom don't really buy into that pan-ethnic label, but might say they're more Vietnamese, more Chinese, etc. And then you also have this, issue of, as the generations go along, as they're far more intermarried, you get into this thorny issue, how Arab do you have to be, right, to be kind of labeled as Arab, right? So it's a really thorny question. And it might simply be that even if you have, generations, of Arabs in your family, you might not have any connection. Again, you might not self-identify. What are we trying to capture, right? What are we trying to understand when we say that we're trying to understand Arab Americans? So a lot of, kind of really interesting and kind of deep debate, I think, is in store, kind of moving forward when within this domain of studying Arab Americans. But at least for the foreseeable future, I can make my students sufficiently uncomfortable when we go into class discussion. I like doing that. All right. Thank you very much, everyone. And I look forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you, Yusuf. That was fascinating. And I remember when I saw on Twitter the discussion that was prompted in your classroom when you put out that question. I think it's one of the moments that led me to think about actually, organizing this webinar, right? Because I think it's a fascinating, and you've touched on so many, I think, important issues that I hope will come up, in the Q&A, and I'm sure lots of provocative questions. I also particularly like the way you ended in thinking about how do we learn from other studies of, how do we think? I think there's both in the study of the Middle East in general, there tends to be sort of an exceptionalism in the way that we think about scholarship in the MENA. And I think the kinds of insights that you're bringing to say, like, we might not actually be that different, and we might be able to learn a lot by looking at how these issues more broadly have been studied in other communities. I think tells us a lot about sort of how to move forward. And some of the limitations that you discussed at the end, I think, are a really good transition to Claudia's work, particularly, some of these questions about self-identification and identity formation that are, maybe harder to get at with some quantitative methodologies that might, be better elucidated, I think, in qualitative approaches. So I think one of the really nice pairings, I think, between Yusuf and Claudia here is also a methodological diversity. So I will pass it to Claudia now. Claudia is having some internet reliability issues, so she's going to keep her personal camera off just to limit bandwidth. So unfortunately, we won't be able to see her face, but we will hear her voice and we will see her wonderful presentation. So pass it over to you, Claudia.
Thank you so much. And I'm not in Lebanon currently, but I'm still having electricity issues, and I think that's maybe the legacy of living in Lebanon. At any rate, okay, so thank you for having me, and sorry about the connectivity issues. So I'm focusing on, again, Arab Americans, and I'm going to go through a little bit of my profile as a scholar, and what I've been doing currently, as well as some epistemological questions that I had relating to Arab American research, followed by a little bit of the research that I have done in Chicago. And thank you for touching on the book research. That's the most recent project we have going on. It kind of gave me different perspective of migration patterns and kind of thinking more broadly about Arabs and Arabs in the Americas, not only in North America. So that was kind of nice. Some research challenges, and then in my new role as Director of Knowledge Management and Research, I've been kind of digging a little bit deeper into the knowledge management component of my role and my job, and it's something that I think we can touch on maybe in discussion a little bit later, in how we as scholars and as researchers can kind of think beyond academicians in the ivory tower to get our research out, to make it more translatable. And in doing things like this and having webinars and, participants that are, not exclusively kind of invited to a session, and it's made widely available. So this is something that I think we can kind of put a pin in now and discuss later on. Let me just, okay. Okay. I think, all right, there you go. Okay, So just a little bit about my profile and interests. So I do work at the American University of Beirut in the business school. And like I said, I'm the Deputy Director of Knowledge Management and Research at the Sybil Center. It's the Center for Inclusive Business and Leadership. We focus widely on the work and women in the Arab MENA region and making work policies and practices more inclusive for women, focusing on recruitment, retention, promotion. So it's nice and it's different for me coming from an academic environment. I served as an assistant professor prior to this position as a sociologist at Finlandia University in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. So this is a lot more practical type of research and applied. So it's really nice for me to put that hat on. But I still definitely have this passion. I would call it more like a passion project and ongoing research and interest in Arab American identity construction and development. And I am definitely a proponent of, kind of echoing what Yusuf was talking about in seeing, more options, racial options and identity options for Arabs in the United States that go past that, of this dichotomy that we currently have between opting for white or other. But a little bit about what interested me in researching Arab Americans. So as an undergrad, I went to Loyola University, and 9/11 happened when I was a freshman. About my senior year, I took a terrorism class, and it was like terrorism in the United States. And that was the only time that I heard in my class any sort of reference to Arab and Muslim Americans. And they were talking about eradicating stereotype and, prejudice and discriminatory practices. But I just thought, it's interesting that that's when we decided to talk about Arab and Muslim Americans. The other part that kind of sparked my interest, and these are two prominent moments for me, is when I realized I didn't have like another option. And this resonates with the majority of Arab Americans, where, you don't see yourself as white, and then you're opting for other, and then you're othered, and this kind of reinforces your othering. So it's just kind of an interesting, those two are really what merged my interest in Arab American research, particularly because I was more interested in actually crime and urban communities before that. So today I'll go through a little bit of my research, like I said, but towards the end, I really want us to think about, what is the role of scholars in the process of Arab American research, and specifically, and we can put a pin in this, but just to think about during this presentation too, what questions are we asking qualitatively if we don't have the means to ask and play with data as much quantitatively? What are we selecting to focus on? Who are we selecting to focus on, and how are we choosing those populations? So when we say something like Arab American, thinking about who we expect to be in our sample pool and who is opting to be in the research, and then what limitations and challenges exist within that, thinking about that like as a pan-ethnic identity, being Arab American, and kind of moving beyond that as in itself a monolithic category that we use quite often. Okay, so my research this is my dissertation project, which I'm publishing on currently. It focused on children of Arab immigrants in the United States. It was an exploratory research. You've probably seen this done in communities across the United States, mostly in urban areas with youth and persons of Arab ancestry. But it was focusing on how youth construct their identities and their identity boundaries. So how are they developing, maintaining, and shifting these boundaries? Mainly focused on ethnic, racial, and national identities, and then having them kind of probe further as they wanted to, in either going further to unpack each of those or talking about them intersectionally. And then the other component was the role of social institutions. So how does the state, education, family, religion, and other contributing factors, like how does one's neighborhood, impact the patterns that we kind of pick up in constructing, developing, maintaining, and shifting those boundaries. So some of this that the other contributing factors included, like, someone's neighborhood, if they lived in somewhere that was highly concentrated with Arabs versus not, that kind of contributed to how they constructed their boundaries and how they maintained and shifted them. So I'll be going into those a little bit more. My selection criteria, so I chose to focus on Arab American millennials born between 1980 and early 2000s. And the reason I chose to focus on millennials is because there's a lot of research on millennials, but there's not a lot of research on Arab American millennials, and the second generation in particular being the children of Arab immigrants, those that were born in the United States or immigrated before 5 years old. And I looked at two, like, kind of, it just so happened, I originally wanted to just focus on Bridgeview, Illinois, which Louis Kankert has done extensive research in this area, and she calls the area an ethnic hub because it's predominantly Arab and Muslim. It's centered around a pretty large Muslim congregation. So the whole neighborhood is, you'll see a lot of stores, ethnic stores, and that kind of thing. So it's really an ethnic hub. You see a lot of immigrant community in the area as well. But her research was couched in 9/11, like right after 9/11, and talking about how there was like a collective trauma that the community experienced, and they didn't have a safe space, and how there was high crime rates, there was physical assault, property attacks, etc. This research is over a decade later, and the reason that I'm focusing on millennials is because there's been also research on distinctive events and how they can demarcate generational experiences. So millennials were actually coming to age while this was happening. And I thought it would be interesting to see, like, over a decade later, how has this shaped their identity, in particular, considering all of this history that their neighborhood has also had in their communities, with their parents, etc. So adolescent and adulthood years are a critical period. So the cohort is really actively reflecting on their experiences. And so this is why I chose Bridgeview as well. Not only that, but it's the Chicagoland area, Bridgeview includes one of the highest population of persons with Arab ancestry, and this has been documented quite a bit. So I constructed a semi-structured interview guide for conversation, and I'm just going to go through some of the themes that the guide included. So it had demographic information, knowledge of defining one's ethnic group, association to that group, and language. So questions like, what makes you Arab? Kind of gauging at the ethnic markers, religious, cultural, when it comes to individual, or ethnic group membership, like food or community, visibility of one's community were kind of brought up there. Social networks. So I asked how, like, who are your closest friends? What race, ethnicity, religion are they? Where did you meet? So kind of gauging at the social network. Leisure activities. So are youth traveling to their parents' homeland? Are they attending ethnic or religious gatherings and other kind of leisure activities? And then the concentration was really interesting because coincidentally, half of my participants were born and raised or immigrated to the Bridgeview area before they were 5 years old, and were really acquainted with the neighborhood and felt very comfortable in the neighborhood. But then the other 50% were kind of scattered around Chicago. So you had people in the north side that when they were asked questions about people, like, what ethnic hubs exist in Chicago, if they were Muslim, then they were very acquainted with the Bridgeview community. But then if they were Christian, it was kind of like above their head. They weren't connected to any of that community. And it was very clear that the mosque and the setting and that locale was really what people gravitated to, and the connections between the north and south side of Chicago was kind of embedded in this religious, this religious tie that the Christian community didn't have. And some of them knew, like, yes, I know on the south side somewhere there's like, some Arabs, but then it's not like they went there or had like any ties to that area as much. But if they were Muslim, then they knew of the neighborhood and they might go on special occasions. And then, so that was kind of an interesting component, the neighborhood component. On the other side, on the other hand, people who were like born and raised, youth that were born and raised in Bridgeview felt very comfortable, for example, in their neighborhoods. But then there was this other component of like being surveilled by, like policed by persons who were identifying, like in relation to their ethno-religious identity, who were like Palestinian Muslim, for example. And they had to navigate their social surroundings carefully. So for example, if they wanted to go to like a hookah lounge, then they knew to go to the north side of the city, because then they wouldn't be surveilled as much and they wouldn't bump into people that they know. Kind of the way that they managed their ethnic and racial boundaries. So the other thing is like navigating various workspaces were the other thing that I thought was really interesting. So although people from the opposite sides of the Chicago might not have known each other and had connections, if they, like the Christian community and the Muslim community, for example, or within the same area, on the north side scattered around, if they were Muslim and Christian, they tended to meet at workplaces or at school. That's the way that they kind of merged with their, like what spaces would kind of, where they would meet each other. It wouldn't be in a religious space where each of those communities on their own, the religious communities, would meet in those designated areas. And then we explored family, dating, and marriage and living arrangements. And in this component, participants really focused on how they were different than the first generation and the immigrant community. And then talked about like their progressiveness and the ways that they found themselves more liberal. There were like a subsector of participants did think that they were just as conservative who lived in Bridgeview. They actually thought they might have been even more conservative than their parents. But for the most part, you saw more progressive attitudes across religious lines. So I'm going to go through each of the key themes just to give a little bit of the quotes that were used by the participants, because I think they're really rich and they're telling of the way that someone expressed themselves and how they felt about things. The key themes that emerged. So the overall crux of this was to gauge how, what is someone's identity who is born or raised in the United States but has Arab ancestry. And there's really a prominent theme being there is an Arab American experience. This is like, I'm not Arab, I'm not American, I'm Arab American. I'm not, one of the participants said, like, I'm not 25% this, I'm not 75% this, like I'm 100% Arab and I'm 100% American. So there's really, this pan-ethnic identity is very real, and it's a very unique experience because it's not either or, it's both, and it's kind of gradient. So someone can be you know, like leaning towards more being progressive in adapting to American culture, but then another person can be more, you know, wedded to like tradition and Arab tradition, and so they might consider themselves like more conservative or liberal than someone else. So there's a lot of variant to say, you know, there's a lot of variant within this specific ethnic identity as Arab American. So the one constant theme that came up.
Sorry, yeah, I just wanted to just flag for time, because I know that you have a number of other elements that you wanted to get to. I was wondering if maybe after you go through these themes, maybe we can move to, because I think some of the methodological challenges that you wanted to get into later will probably are already coming up in the Q&A. So
yeah, that's great. That's great. I'll go through these and then I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Claudia.
Yeah, no, thank you.
This is really,
thank you. So one of the very prominent themes that came up in this Arab American experience is a constant reference to 9/11. So in none of my questions did I mention 9/11, but as a prominent theme in being Arab American was embedded this 9/11 reference. The other thing is that there's a paradox of someone's ethno-racial identity. So definitely not a monolithic group, and they went into like intra and inter distinctions in between the group and across ancestry. And then, you know, delving into more the generational and neighborhood patterns and those dynamics. I'm gonna stop and we can kind of like take questions and kind of go from there. That's okay.
Yeah, that's perfect. I mean, I think that it was, I think you missed large parts of Yusuf's presentation, but I think it was pretty remarkable how much, you know, from a very different methodological approach, there were a lot of the same themes coming up. And I think some really interesting ways in which, you know, qualitatively you were getting at some of these things around, you know, 9/11 being such a critical and pivotal moment, and thinking about, you know, how identities can be solidified around these politicized moments. And already we have a couple of questions in the Q&A that are asking around specifically this question of identity. You know, I think a theme that you wanted to pick up in your research questions, which was, you know, how as scholars, you know, given all of this variation that we see in you know, and the differences and uncertainties around identity, and, you know, Yusuf pointed to the fact that in the sort of the major survey, the Arab American Institute survey, you know, Sudanese and Somalis are included as Arab Americans, but then, you know, if probed, you know, individuals may not actually take on that identity. You know, what are the limits for us as scholars in imposing that identity when we're, you know, doing this research? Sort of what are the tensions inherent in that process of sort of needing to identify a population to study it, but recognizing that that identity that we're imposing. So someone asked, you know, is this just something inherent to the study of identity, right? Is this something that in the question was asked, is this an approach that also, or a challenge that also figures in the study of German Americans, for example, you know, as much as it does for Arab Americans? Or is there something, you know, Yusuf was getting at this a little bit, also the potentially the religious aspect being an important distinction specifically in the Arab American context. And we have another question by Negwa that says, maybe we can speak more about field work. And I'm guessing what she's referring to is more, you know, kind of qualitative approaches of how people define Arab Americans. And I think, Claudia, you were getting at this in your last part of your presentation, right? The sort of multiplicity and the way in which actually they resisted this notion of being Arab and American, but recognizing it as one holistic identity. But I'm sure you also had participants who didn't necessarily feel that way. And also, you know, the question that you already brought up at the beginning of your presentation, which is, you know, there's already a problem of selecting in, right? Who opts in to do the research? So potentially there are participants who are who the Arab American Institute might be considering as Arabs, but who in qualitative research, once you're recruiting, might not even, because of their self-identity, might not even opt in to be research participants in a project that defines itself as researching Arab Americans. So I don't know if you two can talk about the sort of tension there in terms of scholarly approaches and trying to recruit participants, and also recognizing the multiplicity and difficulty of sort of defining that category.
Yusuf, do you want to?
I mean, I can just jump in real quick and just address Constance's question. Thank you very much for that question, by the way. And interesting note, which there's no reason that, especially if you don't live inside the United States, that you would know this. And I would imagine the vast majority of Americans don't know this either. But the largest ancestry group in the United States are German Americans, and so they have come to symbolize or be associated as the kind of archetypal mainline assimilationist group, right? The reason that you don't know that they are the largest ancestry group is because they're so much part of the mainstream now, right? And so when we're talking about issues of identity, certainly we have to think about, context and historical context, not just contemporary context as well. And so, for example, if we're studying, German Americans, I would probably ask, what is it that would actually bring your German identity to the fore? Because the default is that it's not actually a meaningful indicator of your political and social, attitudes and experiences. Conversely, for Arab Americans, my question would be, what would cause your Arab identity to be, put on the back seat, right? Because clearly it's a very salient feature in many individuals' kind of day-to-day existence, how they go through the world. So that's, a kind of clear distinction that I would draw between those two groups. But more broadly as to how we identify Arab Americans, I mean, my personal take on it, and, we can certainly have debates on this, but it's self-identity. Like it just, you can't do anything else, right? Now you can talk about, ancestry, right? So we can have a Minna category and talk about, let's study folks with Minna ancestry. And you have to be mindful though, that you're gonna have Persians and you're gonna have Turks in that sample as well, right? Then we can ask, okay, how about those who identify as Middle Eastern? That's a different group than those who actually have ancestry. And then another group would be, how about those who identify as Arab or Arab American, right? Because at that point, now we're talking about self-identity. That affirmation of identity is that's telling you something, right? And so in one of the really seminal works on Arab American identity by Adrush and Amani Jamel, they find that if you are an Arab Christian, you're less likely to, a Christian of Arab extraction, you're less likely to, buy into this Arab American identity than Arab American Muslims are, right? And so that's a meaningful finding. Now that's from the one study drawing from the Detroit Arab American survey. And so it will be interesting to know, does that port over kind of over time and a more in different geographic contexts?
Yeah, I mean, to speak to that as well, for qualitative research, because we can define who becomes part of our sample, our selection sample. And I think even then, if you say, and this kind of speaks to like who will self-select as being part of my research, if I'm doing research on Arab Americans. And so we know that like Lebanese people with Lebanese ancestry are, and Christian are less likely to identify as Arab. Or, as you were saying with the Chaldean and Maronite Christians, like, how are they racially classifying themselves? There's a lot of issues like with the group itself and the label Arab. So it just gets me to think of, for example, with the selection of who opted into my study. I had far more, there was far more people who were just immediately interested that were Muslim Arab American than Christian Arab American. Now, I don't know exactly why, but we can gauge at why, considering the patterns that we see from what you're kind of echoing, is that, who's more likely to have ethnic markers, who is more likely to be white passing. There's even studies about Arab Americans, and Arabs are, as quite a privileged group, considering where they fall in terms of their average, their income, their the self-selection, even in migration patterns, right? There is privilege that comes with that. And there's also kind of echoing what Mary Waters would say about ethnic options. We have racial options, the fact that you could kind of opt into one category or another, and when it comes to on paper, the way that people see that is, there's a set of people that see, for the most part, this is a disadvantage. We need our own category. There's a very small percentage that also think I don't know what I would do in this case, considering the history of how people have racially classified and then been scrutinized for it. There's kind of a little bit of worry. So it's kind of we have to unpack what this means, I think, for our community in the way that they self-select, in the way that they identify themselves. And so when we're putting this out there, as researching Arab Americans in a qualitative context, is there kind of a selection bias of who we end up kind of, oversampling in a way?
Yeah, absolutely. That's very, very insightful. I think I mean, personally, I think there's my understanding from both of you is that there's also probably something to be said about, the expectation of surveillance and also the post 9/11 moment for probably also explaining some of these shifts. I wonder, it's too bad that we don't have better data on this. It would be really interesting to understand also how this changed over time. Yusuf talked about the temporal limitations, right? We can sort of have conjectures about what created or potentially, but because we don't have the data to look at this pre 9/11, it's or at least we, not as much. It's more difficult, but there's been a boom in historical work on Arab Americans. I feel, at least in the last little while, between Stacey Farenthold and Amy. So there's some really interesting historical work coming out that hopefully will be able to help us think about these questions as well. We have two really interesting questions in the Q&A that I'm going to put them both out there, and because I think one of them, Yusuf, you probably want to talk about more, and I think the second, Claudia, you might have some more insights on. So one of the questions really is trying to probe the importance of the Arabic language in particular, both in sort of potentially how people identify, whether the Arabic language remains an important part of it and knowledge of the Arabic language, but also, is it still vibrant within the community? To the extent that people, still take Arabic classes. I know for me as an Arab Canadian, one of the Americas, I went to Arabic classes as, I came to Canada, I was 5, and I think that was pretty, even though I only stayed for a couple of years, it was pretty pivotal, I think, in shaping my own relationship to Arabic. It'd be interesting to hear some of your thoughts on that. And then for Yusuf, we have some questions about sort of the history and trajectory of Arab American voter behavior. I don't know how much historical work we have on this to talk about trajectories, but, do we have estimates, for example, for the number of Arab Americans who voted for Trump in 2016 versus 2020? Has there been, and this, you talked about this a little bit at the end, there might be sort of a regression back to the mean. And what does that say, if anything, about Arab American voter preferences? And here I maybe would like to add, questions also, in your survey, I don't know if you probed this, I think you would have probably shown it if you did, but I was very curious to also try to think about anti-Black and anti-Blackness within the Arab American community and the extent to which that maybe also has generational differences. I know that was, and I don't know how much we can infer from that from voting behavior for Obama, for example, but also I know that that's been part of the analysis, at least in the media landscape, of what might explain some pro-Trump voting behavior in the 2020 election among Arab Americans, and the extent to which this is just media speak, and whether we have data to back that up. I know that's a lot, so just try to get at some of that potentially, and we'll probably run a little bit long on our expected webinar time, hopefully, but hopefully we can wrap this up around 10:05 EST. So I'll pass it to whichever one of you wants to take the first of those questions.
Claudia, please go ahead. Yeah, okay. I think a lot of people want to hear about voting patterns and the whole and that aspect. So I'll be fairly quick. So your question is basically in terms of Arabic language, what are we doing as far as keeping it vibrant within the community? And if anyone,
yeah, and the extent to which maybe it affects identity, whether people speak the language, does it shape?
Yeah, okay. So yes, absolutely. And I think there's two parts of someone's identity that I would say really feed into like the impact of whether they have a desire to maintain a linguistic fluency or not. Definitely a religious tie, because reading the Quran means that you have to read Arabic. And then the level of religiosity. So it's like if you have a desire to continue your education in that kind of capacity. There are second generation, young parents who I had like no one in their house can speak anything other than Arabic. And these are, youth who are born and raised in the States. So there's some where it's like, this is a very prominent part of our identity. Like if you don't speak Arabic, then what makes you Arabic, Arab? So I think that was really, really important for some people. But then, it seemed that it was tied in with a religious aspect, and then tied in with how you perceived yourself within the community. So it's like if you were more likely to have friends and social ties that were out of the Arab community, out of the Arab network, then you kind of cared about it less in maintaining it. And you were also able to maintain it less because you had less opportunity to kind of speak it. People in Bridgeview, though, really were able to maintain it more because there's a higher immigrant population there. And so it's like my uncle just came from the Middle East and, or my grandma, or, like they had a really closer ethnic community and tie. And so that was sort of played into the level of fluency that they had. So yeah, it kind of varied, I guess.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I mean, I imagine that, yeah, it's going to be complex for sure. I mean, that's a question even in the Arab world, right? When we study about Arab identity in the Arab world, the question of, when we think about the Maghrib and the extent to which kind of a standardized Arabic is critical to identity. So that's really interesting to see that also in the Arab American context. Yusuf, I'll pass it over to you for the myriad set of questions around basically the history of Arab American voter behavior in 5 minutes.
Yeah. So as you kind of alluded to, we don't really have much insight into Arab American voting behavior too far into the past. One thing that we can say is that the first time there was a so-called Muslim bloc vote, it was for the Republican presidential candidate in the year 2000. For those of you who don't remember, George W. Bush, and there was a large kind of immigrant push in particular for that, and so that minority community, American Muslims more generally, Arab Americans included within them, were kind of leaning more towards the Republican even back then, right? And it's if you think about it, right, the kind of social conservatism, the tendency to be entrepreneurs, right? I mean, that does kind of mesh with the kind of Reaganite view of the Republican Party that proliferated at that time. That Reaganite view of the Republican Party is not exactly central at the moment, but nonetheless, there's still, some appeal to the Republican Party among more socially conservative elements, both within the American Muslim community as well as within the broader Arab American community. In terms of racial attitudes, a finding that kind of blew my mind was in that same data that I showed you about the voting behavior, the Arab American Institute, that's their tracking poll, that's where that came from. They also asked, overall, what is your opinion of demonstrations in the country in support of Black lives? 46% of all Arab Americans have a strongly positive view. 24% have a somewhat positive view. So you're talking about, fully 3/4 of the Arab American population that have a positive view of the Black Lives Matter protests. So that's really saying something. But that's not to say that they buy into the general kind of woke agenda, if you want to be, kind of crude about it, right? And I think that was kind of partly what was, kind of pushing some folks towards Trump. I would say probably more folks towards Trump than in 2016. We see this in a number of patterns among various minority groups, and Arab Americans are included within them. And so I'll conclude by just saying that when we are studying Arab Americans, and to the point that I was making during my presentation as well, we can't imagine that this is a special, oh so special, unique snowflake of a group. Like, no, they're going to be in the same environment as other communities. They're going to have the same social forces acting on them, pushing them or pulling them in certain directions. And we have to be cognizant of that, and the various dynamics that exist within comparable groups may very well be the same ones that we see within this minority group as well.
Wow, that was incredible. So succinct and also incredibly, yeah, very enriching. I mean, I was both very much pleasantly surprised about the statistic you brought out around perceptions of the Black Lives Matter protests. And I think, yeah, there's so much interesting analysis there. And I think probably many people didn't know about the sort of major vote, Arab and Muslim vote for George W. Bush, right? I think the way in which history kind of gets rewritten in our minds sometimes around that moment. There are other really interesting questions that are already coming up in the Q&A, but unfortunately we don't have, we're already running over time. But I really just wanted to thank you both. I think that what you've presented today, I think is so critical for both sort of understanding current politics and trying to understand, things related to, voter behavior in the US elections, which is obviously on top of a lot of people's minds, but I think more profoundly, I think added so much to the conversation about how we study Arab Americans, in the United States, but also how some of the patterns that you've identified are actually sort of can more broadly be thought about, as Yusuf said, to other minorities. But also I felt there were some really interesting parallels to some of the research being done in the MENA as well. And the last question actually that we can't get to is trying to push us in that direction to think about, identity formation in the Maghreb, for example, right? And how people identify there, and whether Arab identity, not Arab American identity in that context, but Arab identity at all, sort of how that captures youth in the Maghreb. So thank you both, and I hope, so for those of you who, who again are new to APSN, I really encourage you to sign up to our newsletter, and to also, if you have any suggestions and ideas for webinars that you'd like to see, to please let us know. There'll be, hopefully in the chat box, maybe already there has been, I haven't been following the chat box as much as the Q&A, links to our Twitter and our Facebook. And I really want to thank both our participants, Dr. Shud and Dr. Joachim, again for their time today, and for sharing such wonderful insights with us.
Thank you, Lama. And thank you,
Yusuf. Lama. Yes, thank you too, Claudia. Thank you everyone in the audience too, appreciate it.
Bye everyone.
Talk soon. Bye.